SpaceX's Starship rocket is an engineering marvel. It's been cleverly designed and carefully built by thousands of talented scientists, engineers, and dreamers. It's smashed records and achieved mighty goals, even in its program's infancy. It promises to do more than any other spacecraft. In fact, in many ways, it promises to do more than every other spacecraft combined. With every launch, the Starship's goals inch a little closer to reality. And I hate it. Hi, I'm Bagel. Yes, I'm trans. Hopefully y'all won't be too weird about it. Two quick things before the video essay begins. One, I'm aiming to make a video that an average person would enjoy watching. As a result, I will oversimplify things in some places, although I'm still striving for accuracy. Two, Starship's plans are changing literally all the time. Like, since I started writing this essay, they switched some stuff up. I'm going to try to future-proof this video a little and assume that Starship will eventually live up to its design specifications, that it will be fully reusable, that it will have a low failure rate, and that it will be able to carry about 100 tons of cargo into low Earth orbit. This video is not about the short-term stuff, it is about long-term issues. Just because SpaceX can make Starship doesn't mean that they should. Got it? Let's begin. I promise I'll get to Starship in a sec, but this is the most important part of the video, so hear me out. So rockets have this certain mystique, right? They're sleek and speedy and futuristic and just a little Freudian. In popular culture, they're super beloved. Many people build and fly model rockets for fun. They sink hundreds of hours into games like Kerbal Space Program, and they love learning about spaceflight's history and discussing its future. And to be very clear, I am one of those many people. I love space stuff, it's super cool. But we gotta establish something right off the bat. Even with all their glitz and glamour, rockets are delivery vehicles. A rocket's only goal is to bring some cargo or some people to a certain destination, traveling at a certain speed, at a certain time, and under a certain budget. The only difference between rockets and other types of delivery vehicle is that a rocket's destination is usually outer space. So that requires some pretty fancy engineering and some pretty hefty costs to accomplish, and it also means that rockets have historically been less reusable and more prone to failure than, say, planes or trains or automobiles. It also means that the market for rockets is much more limited. Many people want to transport goods around the world, but not a lot of people want to launch their stuff into space. But other than that, rockets basically have the same goals as any other delivery vehicle. So a bunch of YouTubers have gained a pretty substantial following by explaining rocket science. And to be clear, I'm not here to cancel those people or anything. In fact, they're super knowledgeable, and I personally love their videos. But there's more to rocketry than rocket science. And I think sometimes the science educatory types miss the bigger picture a little. Like, sure, Starship is definitely innovative. It's got some great design features, and it's fun to watch it fly. But for the rest of the video essay, we're going to talk about Starship as a delivery vehicle. What does Starship plan to deliver? and where? Will it be effective? And will it benefit humanity in the process? Spoiler alert, no. So I thought I would pull a Jenny Nicholson for this part and get dressed up like Starship. So look, I've got the steel gray, I've got the belt for like the interstage, and then I even have the X's for SpaceX. This is the hard-hitting space journalism that you all crave. So Starship was built with a single goal in mind, and that goal was to permanently colonize Mars, and later colonize the rest of the solar system. Why does Elon Musk have this goal? Because he thinks that his Mars colony will be the only respite for humanity after the world ends. And he thinks the world will end soon. Hi, this is future Bagel. I do have receipts for that claim, and I'll get to them later in the video. Just didn't want to disturb the flow too much. You may think this is a weird spur-of-the-moment thought, but Elon's been publicly talking about it for over 2 decades, and probably thinking about it for even longer. After all, his family is a huge fan of colonizing. So, if things play out exactly according to plan, Elon makes his big Mars colony, and then just as the Mars colony begins to thrive, the world becomes uninhabitable, and he's viewed as the one true savior of humanity. And if that doesn't happen, well, we'll get to that later. So Starship was designed by SpaceX as a delivery vehicle to send infrastructure and people to Mars. It turns out, though, that colonizing the solar system is very expensive, and at least within the next few hundred years, it's very unprofitable. Like, Elon has publicly stated that his goal is to make lots of money elsewhere so he can pour it into his passion project. As a result, SpaceX wants to use Starship to make money however they can. And those money-making ideas range from bad to worse. So let's deconstruct all of Starship's money-making schemes, and then we can talk about using it to colonize Mars. They do have plans to colonize Mars, right? Elon's had this idea for decades, and he even built a big rocket about it, so they must have plans, right? I turned off my background light because space is dark. So I'm starting with the idea of launching satellites because it's been ubiquitous in the space industry for like half a century, and it's very easy to understand. A company or a nation's military builds a satellite, and then they tell a rocket company to take that satellite into a certain orbit around the Earth. The rocket goes whoosh, and it drops off the payload. Job done. SpaceX has used Falcon 9 and Falcon 9 Heavy to do this for a while. And those rockets have worked very well, but they eventually plan on retiring them and switching exclusively to Starship. Furthermore, they say that Starship will become the cheapest option to launch anything into space, which, I don't know, might make sense in theory. Starship is very big and also reusable, so it could carry a huge amount of stuff and then come back for more. So in theory, that plan is pretty PogChamp. Poggers, one might say. Huge dubs in the chat. But it relies on a few assumptions that are far, far less poggers. Let's talk about them. I'm not using that tape. Assumption 1. Starship would need to be reliable and reusable, with a short turnaround time between launches. This is one that many rocket nerds fixate on, and I think it's plausible. I'll briefly mention that it's much more difficult to recover and reuse a rocket than it is to launch one for the first time. It'll probably be a couple years before anything gets reflown, and I'm sure there are a few technical challenges ahead that nobody even knows about, but to me, it seems plausible longer term. Assumption 2. Demand for satellite launches would have to be higher than it's ever been, and it would have to remain high for decades. I'm gonna pause for a sec and talk about this. There's this super important metric in spaceflight called the cost per kilogram. That's how much it costs to launch a kilogram of stuff to its destination. So what's Starship's cost per kilogram? It seems like SpaceX is targeting about $100 or less per kilo to low Earth orbit. Okay, so how much would that earn them? According to the European Space Agency, there were around 1,000 to 1,100 metric tons worth of satellites launched into orbit in 2023. That's more than any other year in spaceflight history. But even if Starship took that entire market, which it won't, it would earn about $110 million. That's not much. At that price, even if Starship was Earth's sole launch provider, they could afford maybe 2 or 3 new rockets a year, and that's it. Listen, I know that SpaceX will charge more than this, especially at first, and I know that contracts exist, but I still can't look at those numbers without thinking that SpaceX is anticipating an unbelievable increase in spaceflight demand. And personally, I don't see where all that demand would come from. Even now, a lot of a satellite's cost usually comes from its construction and maintenance, so a cheaper launcher probably wouldn't lead to an explosion in demand. But more importantly, the spaceflight market is super volatile, especially for commercial payloads. Like, the number of satellites launched by the US tripled during the dot-com boom, and then it plunged right back down again when that bubble burst a few years later. But fortunately, nowadays, we've figured the economy out. The stonks will go up forever, so they'll never be a problem ever again, right? Okay, tangent over, we're still doing the list. Assumption 3, no other companies would undercut SpaceX's prices for the next several decades. If Starship ever stopped being the cheapest option, companies may switch to other launch vehicles, possibly setting off a negative feedback loop. Having fewer payloads to fly would mean higher prices, and the higher prices would mean fewer payloads to fly. You get the picture. And there's a load of hungry upstarts who want a bite of that warm Elon pie. Daddy Jeff is building New Glenn. Rocket Lab has Electron and is working on Neutron. Stoke Aerospace is trying for 100% reusable design. Firefly Aerospace is trying to build their MLV. Relativity Space is planning Terran R. Russia's working on the Soyuz 7, and China's planning the Long March 9, Long March 10, and Tianlong 3, among others. Not all of these will work. In fact, most of them probably won't long term. But if even one of them is cheaper than Starship with similar reliability, SpaceX would have a problem. And by the way, if SpaceX tries the Silicon Valley method of undercutting everyone else's prices by operating at a loss, they would run into problems immediately, because assumption 4, SpaceX needs to be making a profit here to colonize Mars. So they really should try to squeeze every cent out of this that they can, because otherwise they'll be losing money as they work towards their goal of losing a lot more money. By the way, no other rocket company has Mars colonization as an item on their budget sheet. So not only would SpaceX have to remain the cheapest option for decades, they'd be doing so at a huge disadvantage. So this plan might not be great, from a cash flow standpoint at least. But remember, I was only talking about satellites that other people give SpaceX. What about the satellites they build themselves? Starlink is a fustercluck of about 7,000 SpaceX satellites in low Earth orbit. For those of you who don't know, 7,000 satellites is a lot of satellites. What does SpaceX plan to do with all those little guys? It aims to provide internet access to the world. Bear in mind that none of those satellites were launched with Starship, only with SpaceX's current Falcon 9 rockets, but Starship could feasibly launch a lot more of them at once. Satellite internet has been around since the 90s. It's not a bad idea, although its use cases are somewhat limited. How does it work? Each individual satellite in a constellation receives data from ground stations or from other satellites, and then they send a certain amount of that data to the users that are down below them. If many people are concentrated in a small space, satellite internet will struggle to serve all of their needs simultaneously. You need a bunch of satellites overhead to provide enough bandwidth for everyone. If people are spread out, though, you wouldn't need as many satellites overhead to give them all their juicy bits and bytes. This, combined with the lack of good internet in rural areas, means that satellite internet is useful and even maybe profitable. Hey, this is Editing Bagel. So since I started writing this video essay, 2 major hurricanes have struck the United States of America: Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. Starlink is great for providing disaster response, and Elon said that he would give disaster victims a free month of Starlink internet as long as they bought a $350 base station and switched to a $150 a month payment plan after. And that's just such a cool way to fund your Mars colony. That's just so cool. Good job, Elon. Satellite internet can also connect to moving vehicles, like ships or airplanes, and it's also great for military operations. So, of course, the United States military has given SpaceX lots of money for Starlink, and SpaceX, in turn, has helped the military out with their needs. This has had some ethically dubious consequences. For example, Palestinians in Gaza are not being offered Starlink, but Israel is. Not a fan of that one, Chief. And even with the military propping it up, Starlink's barely squeaking out a profit. Launching thousands of satellites isn't cheap, and maintaining them isn't cheap either. So switching to an, as of yet, more expensive and less reliable rocket might not be a great business decision, especially if you're also trying to use that to finance a Mars colony. Again, maybe it'll pay off in the long run, but again, if you're bleeding too much money, you won't have that long to run. I'm gonna briefly mention Kessler syndrome here. So everything in orbit is moving very fast, and if 2 objects ever hit one another, the kinetic energy is enough to destroy them utterly, sending out shrapnel in all directions. If a piece of that shrapnel hits another object, that'll be destroyed too. And this could cause a chain reaction that turns an entire shell around Earth into a terrifying debris field. Starlink satellites have actually taken some great steps to avoid this risk, like cautiously dodging everything that's in their orbit. But the more things that get launched, the denser the possible debris field. Right now, the spaceflight consensus is anyone can launch anything they want as long as everyone's perfectly careful forever. And that becomes a more and more dangerous sort of notion every day. So even if Starlink satellites don't start the cascade, it would quickly become impossible for them to avoid all that debris, and they wouldn't last long. There's a tiny but non-zero chance the Kessler syndrome cascade could begin at any moment. This means that SpaceX could provide Starlink services for 100 years, or that everything could be completely destroyed forever by next month. And I'm not a business major, but that seems like a huge and growing liability. By the way, remember how Starship wants to launch hundreds of tons of other people's satellites to low Earth orbit too? And also remember how they want to use Starship to colonize Mars? And how you probably shouldn't do that if you have to pass through a thick layer of hypersonic shrapnel first? Hey, speaking of leaving Earth... On April 16th, 2021, NASA gave SpaceX a $2.89 billion contract to develop a lunar lander. In theory, their decision made a lot of sense and was great for everyone involved. SpaceX got paid to develop their systems, and NASA gets to land people on the moon again. So it's a win-win, right? In practice, well, NASA wanted a demonstration flight to the moon by the end of this year, but it's been delayed by 2 full years, and it's likely to be delayed even further. It's time to talk about how Starship plans on traveling beyond Earth, and how much work that's going to take. Getting to space takes a lot of rocket fuel, and getting to orbit takes a lot more fuel. Modern chemical rockets are cleverly built, and they have pretty decent fuel efficiency, but even so, by the time they get to orbit, their fuel tanks are usually just about empty. Robert Heinlein once said that if you're in orbit, you're halfway to getting anywhere. But most rockets, including the Starship, only have enough oomph to get to that halfway point. So, the engineers thought, we don't have enough chutzpah to make it out of Earth orbit with one rocket. But wait, we can launch Starship to orbit with a little bit of fuel left over. So, step 1, we can launch a transport ship to orbit. Step 2, we can launch a fueling ship up to dock with the transport ship and pump all this extra fuel into the transport ship's tanks. And step 3, we can repeat this process 10 more times, adding a little more fuel each go until the transport ship's tanks are full. By the end, we're halfway to anywhere with a full tank of gas. That's genuinely such a cool idea. There are, however, 4 big things that must happen for this idea to work. First of all, you need to be able to pump 2 types of fuel from one rocket to another in zero gravity. This is surprisingly difficult because the fuel just sort of floats around up there. Secondly, you need to have good long-term cryogenic propellant storage. Starship uses liquid oxygen and liquid methane as its fuels, and both of these liquids turn into gas if their temperature rises above like 200 degrees below 0 Celsius. It'll take a while to launch all your fueling ships, so you need to keep things consistently cold for weeks or months. And you need to make sure that the cold isn't making any pieces of your rocket too brittle. 3, you need a rapid launch cadence. The faster you launch your fueling ships, the better. And 4, you need a very reliable rocket. If the first 8 fueling ships work perfectly, but the 9th one blows up, you need to do a big investigation on why it failed and implement safety measures on all your future rockets, and all the while your transport ship would just be floating around up there trying to keep its temperature under control, unable to go anywhere. At this point, I will remind you that Starship rockets currently have a 50% success rate on the way up and a 50% success rate on the way down. Which, I mean, it'll get better, but there's still a long way to go. Now, SpaceX is very innovative, and they have a lot of great engineers, but that's still a ton of work to complete by next year. It would take some good luck and a lot of grit to pull it off. But if enough smart people work enough overtime, they might just be able to make it happen. Remember though, that all of this effort and innovation has to happen just to fill a fuel tank. After that, the transport ship has to light its engines multiple times to send it off to a moon orbit, which is surprisingly difficult. It has to do a deep space crew rendezvous with yet another rocket. It has to have good enough life support systems to safely transfer a crew on board. And then that transport ship has to land people on the moon. Yes, it's also a moon lander, remember? And just a reminder, all of this also has to be designed, built, and tested until it's safe within 2 years. I'm trying not to make this section too long, but there are genuinely so many things that would have to happen perfectly for this mission to work. Some of you may be asking, well, we already went to the moon back in 1969? That's over half a century ago, before even the invention of the Crunchwrap Supreme, let alone the Cheez-It Tostada. Why do we need to take all these steps to get back there? And the answer is, we don't. There have been other proposals by other companies to put people on the moon, and all of these other proposals were much easier to achieve with our current technology. This is because every other aerospace company saw NASA's contract to build a lunar lander and thought, we should build a lunar lander. But SpaceX saw it and thought, we should use this to build our Mars colony ship, which is a much more difficult thing to do, by the way, and call that a lunar lander. So SpaceX bid lower than everyone else with this insanely optimistic proposal, pocketed the money, and immediately fell years behind schedule. Now listen, I know that anyone who knows anything about spaceflight or about the United States government is well aware that overpromising, underdelivering, and overpricing are very common problems, and I know that NASA's SLS rocket is also just incredibly over budget and behind schedule itself. But that doesn't make Starship any better. Two rockets can both be bad at the same time. And while SLS is getting a lot of hate, and in my opinion that hate is pretty well justified, Starship is just getting a lot of love. Except from me! Speaking of hating ideas, what if you used Starship like an airplane? What if you loaded a bunch of people on your big Starship rocket and flew them halfway around the world? Better yet, what if you didn't do that? Never, not even once. Holy fuck! Starship point-to-point transport is a terrible idea that will never, ever happen. It's too unsafe, it's too expensive, it's too strenuous for the people flying, and the market for it is too small. Next section. It's cash money o'clock, baby! So at this point I started wondering, none of the use cases for Starship seem like they would be profitable, and some of them seem straight up ludicrous. So why were any of these ideas even suggested in the first place? Why is SpaceX trying to use a Mars delivery vehicle to do all its other odd jobs? I'm going to offer a quick disclaimer and say that I don't know too much about finance. I took one class in college which should not be enough for you to uncritically believe me, but it is enough that I'm now smarter than every crypto bro combined. So that's a start. There are three main ways that a rocket company can make money. First, they can fly commercial payloads. Second, they can get government contracts to fly government or military payloads. And third, they can convince investors to, well, invest. So I've been exclusively talking about the first and second categories here so far. And from that perspective, all signs point to Starship being barely profitable at best and hideously unprofitable at worst. It won't make enough to colonize Mars regardless. I'll briefly mention that this calculation includes the billions of dollars that SpaceX is desperate to scrounge up from the government every year. When Elon Musk goes to the White House asking for help on any of his many subsidized projects, whether it's electric cars that don't drive long enough, driverless cars that crash, or rocket ships to nowhere, without which subsidies he'd be worthless, and he tells the government that he's a big fan and supporter, the government could say, drop to your knees and beg, and Elon would do it. And if it sounds like I'm being harsh here, that right there was a barely paraphrased quote from former President Donald Trump. In the 2 years since Trump made that post, Elon's dropped to his knees and begged enough that Trump might have circled back around to liking him. And he's apparently willing to give him some federal money for Starship if given the chance. But even on the off chance that Donald Trump wins the presidential election, he will die in his sleep of heart failure on August 9th, 2027. And Elon can't build a Mars colony by then. So let's turn our attention to private investors, shall we? As of this June, SpaceX has a $210 billion private market evaluation. And that just keeps on climbing. They've used that massive evaluation to attract over $10 billion worth of investments, and they hold additional funding rounds all the time. Part of their evaluation is built on their past successes, and credit where it's due, SpaceX has succeeded at a lot. But most of it is built on their future plans. So, while SpaceX's ultimate goal is to funnel a ton of money into Mars colonization, which would probably yield zero return on investment within any of our lifetimes, they need to invent all these other use cases. Everything I've mentioned so far exists exclusively to justify the Starship's cost and keep investors happy. So it doesn't matter whether Starship's use cases are actually profitable, and it doesn't even matter if they're possible. As long as they're able to dazzle investors and convince them to fork over some cash. Starship is a 398-foot-tall monument to government misspending and venture capital run amok, to convincing a bunch of boardrooms that you know exactly what you're talking about. Look at this big rocket, they say. Why, you could use it for everything your pretty little heart desires. Don't ask for specifics, just let your imagination run free. Trust us. We're rocket scientists, after all. And then they use that money to blow up another rocket. Whoops! But please don't get the wrong idea. Elon Musk's goal is to make a Mars colony to save humanity. And if that means conning a bunch of multi-millionaires and billionaires in the process, so be it. Like, if rich people lose money, but humanity is saved in the process, that's a win-win in my book. Only one problem. That logic assumes that SpaceX will be able to colonize Mars. So can they? No. But can they within the next several decades? Also no. Hear me out. So I based this look on that one twink in the Viking photo, you know, that one. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, dark top upper lip, little bit androgynous, we're so in it. Here's a 3-sentence recap of Starship's flight plans, because I know we talked about a lot since then. So the goal is to send up a transport ship to gradually refuel it in orbit by using multiple fueling ships, and then to launch it towards Mars when its tanks are full. The rocket would then coast towards Mars for about 7 months. It would enter the Martian atmosphere and slow down through shock heating and aerodynamic drag. It'd fire its engines back up and it would safely land on the surface. The Starship is very tall, so its cargo and or any people aboard would have to descend to the Martian surface on some sort of freight elevator. And then the mission's done. Bada bing, bada boom. Starship, as a delivery vehicle, has been optimized for this goal decently. And this is the only good thing that I'll say about it in this entire section, so the Starship enjoyers out there better savor my words. Given the current state of technology, SpaceX did an okay job at making a Mars cargo delivery vehicle. Good job, SpaceX. But before you break out the sparklers and champagne, remember what I said all the way back at the beginning of the video. Rockets are delivery vehicles, and a rocket is less important than the cargo it carries. So let's talk about SpaceX's plans of putting humans on Mars. These can be broken down into two big categories: transporting base building materials and transporting people. So before we get any further, will Starship be reliable enough to colonize Mars? Elon Musk has said that he wants to launch multiple Starships per day. But at that rate, how long would it be before a mission failed? Let's say that SpaceX was 99% successful with each launch, and that it would take about 10 launches to fully fuel a tanker ship in orbit. Then they'd have a 99% chance of successfully doing the Mars transfer burn, a 99% chance of successfully surviving the 9-month deep space journey, a 99% chance of surviving Martian atmospheric entry, and a 99% chance of successfully landing their rocket on Mars. And just to be clear, these are great numbers that no space agency has ever achieved at scale. How many Mars missions, on average, would it take before there was a failure? Is it 99 missions? Is it 50 missions? No. There is a greater than 50% chance failure after 5 Mars missions. That's the tyranny of probability, baby! Remember, at best, each mistake would cost a bunch of money and cause delays, and at worst, it would kill over 100 people. And also remember, we're just talking about the failure rate of the rocket hardware here. Like, when you're launching people, there are so many ways that they can die that are totally unrelated to rocket science. According to Elon Musk, Starship will be absolutely packed with people. Like, imagine 100 people living in a grain silo for half a year, eating, sleeping, chatting, and pooping all within a few feet of each other. There wouldn't be room to sneeze. The closest analog to riding on Starship is probably living in a nuclear submarine. And the United States Navy has a rigorous training and filtration process to separate those who can handle being a submariner from those who can't. And even then, some people just don't have what it takes. That's a hazard on a 2-month submarine patrol, but it's a much bigger hazard on a half-a-year-long one-way trip to Mars. Aside from the psychological problems of stuffing 100 people in a little tube, there are also many huge logistical problems. How do you provide oxygen to 100 people for half a year? How do you keep them fed and hydrated? How do you handle pissin' and shittin'? How do you provide electricity? How do you dissipate excess heat into space? How would you shield them from radiation? What sort of airlock would you have to use for leaving the craft? And how can you build in enough redundancy for everyone to survive, even if something goes wrong? It'll be difficult to build adequate life support systems for Starship. And this type of task has never even been attempted before, so it would come with its fair share of challenges. But I think that given enough time and effort, it's possible. But like, as far as anyone can tell, SpaceX hasn't really made progress on that yet. And that's absolutely ridiculous. No one should ever start building a passenger vehicle until they're absolutely sure the passengers could survive riding in the vehicle? Okay, so let's say that SpaceX miraculously figures out how to get people to Mars without killing them 100% of the time. Even then, all their efforts are useless unless they have a Mars colony for the astronauts to go to. So what infrastructure does Starship plan on sending to Mars? no, seriously, what infrastructure does Starship plan on sending to Mars? We've gotten a few CGI renders for the purposes of inspiring the populace, and that's it. And what's worse, all the renders look pretty different from one another. SpaceX fangirls know their animation team just makes up cool looking stuff when the engineers haven't designed anything yet. Which isn't a problem on its own, but it does imply that they don't have any solid plans for any Mars structure. But one of the few things we do know for certain is that there'll be Cybertrucks on Mars! Yeah, baby! I love this decision. Many colonists would be spared from a slow and painful death by radiation poisoning, or asphyxiation, or starvation, or loneliness, and instead they'd just die when their Cybertruck spontaneously combusted. Great thinking. Just to be clear, it is so much more difficult to create a safe and self-sustaining Mars colony than it is to create a rocket like Starship. Humans have been able to send probes to Mars for like half a century, but we have never ever built a closed ecosystem capable of sustaining human life, even on Earth. The closest we've ever come was the Biosphere 2 project in the early 90s. And that's a topic for a different day. It's genuinely a fascinating story, and I'd love to talk about it in some other video. But suffice it to say, a biological habitat that spanned 8,400 square meters of vegetation couldn't sustainably keep a crew of 8 people alive. Oxygen levels plummeted, the food was awful, some of the crew got injured, and tensions ran high. And need I remind you, all of this took place on Earth. It's 1,000,000 times easier to build big structures on Earth than it is on Mars, and if anything goes wrong, it is 1,000,000 times less likely to kill you. The second mission of Biosphere 2 ended soon after someone broke a window and let some outside air in. And on Earth, that was disappointing. But on Mars, it would have killed everyone, you know? So to recap, Starship isn't anywhere near being ready to send things to Mars. But even once it is, they have no idea what they'll send there. They don't know what to build, and they don't know how it could keep people alive long term. Nobody has good answers for those questions yet. A rocket is a delivery vehicle, but SpaceX has made the blunder of designing and building Starship before even conceiving of its cargo. Maybe Elon wanted to attract investors with his massive throbbing rocket, or maybe he genuinely thought that making the rocket would be the hard part of colonizing Mars, and that the rest would be easy. But regardless, Starship is going to be borderline useless unless SpaceX knows how to make a sustainable Mars colony. And nobody's even come close to figuring that out. A useless rocket is a bad rocket. Starship is a bad rocket. But this is a solvable problem, right? Like, if SpaceX just thinks things through for a few decades, and if they make a bunch of prototypes and test them extensively, they could probably build a good Mars habitat. I mean, sure, Starship would be basically useless for the next couple decades, and sure, it would lose a lot of money, but I guess they could just go back to their old rockets for the time being. So what's the real problem here? I wanted to copy my Starship look from earlier, but make it evil. Oh, I'm so excited for this part. So let's start by re-examining Elon Musk's MO. He wants to colonize Mars because he thinks the world is most likely going to end soon, and that he alone can save humanity. Yes, really. I know that's a bold claim, but I've got receipts. Like, Elon talks about the world ending all the time. He says there's a 20% chance that AI will destroy humanity. It won't. He says there's an even greater risk from underpopulation. There isn't. He worries about nuclear war. Okay, that one might be kind of valid. And he's afraid of a global societal collapse that's somehow caused by one unified world government. I wonder if that last one has anything to do with his documented history of anti-Semitism. Perhaps we'll never know. But beyond his words, Elon sure is acting like the world will end soon. He's chosen to worry a lot less about the long-term threat of climate change. He's trying to scrounge up cash as quickly as possible, and most importantly for this video essay, he's trying to fast-track his Starship rocket. Like, if you're pumping tens of billions of dollars into a doomsday bunker, and if you're trying to build your doomsday bunker as soon as humanly possible, your actions are speaking pretty loudly. I'll also mention that Elon might be trying to escape Earth for more personal reasons. He's very good at using money to run away from his problems, after all. But I'm going to be charitable here and say that Elon Musk is not trying to leave Earth before he is convicted as a sex offender. I'm just gonna keep on throwing Elon Musk some bones here. Let's say that he is colonizing Mars for completely valid reasons and that the end of the world is nigh, which it isn't. And let's say that Elon knows how to transport loads of people to Mars, which he doesn't. And then let's say that he can build a Mars colony that can safely sustain life, which he absolutely can't. Even then, wouldn't a post-apocalyptic Earth still be more habitable than Mars? Like, even if the air and water became toxic or something, at least there'd still be air and water around to purify. Mars doesn't have much of either. There have been numerous mass extinction events on Earth which have killed off most of its species, but some critters survived and repopulated the planet every single time. But in comparison, on Mars, you could easily wipe out a colony by accident. Like, what if a rocket was landing, but it missed the pad and it hit your colony? What if someone shut down a heater and your crops froze? What if there was a gas leak that poisoned your air? And if you're nasty and wicked, it's also very easy to destroy a Mars colony on purpose. Elon's apparently working with the assumption that people will destroy themselves if given the chance over here on Earth. But I guess he thinks they'd never do that on Mars. And how can he say that with any certainty? Is there a test you can perform, some exam or questionnaire that would ensure that all the good people go to Mars while all the bad people stay on Earth? That shit sounds like the premise for a bad YA novel. Here are some more goofy questions to consider. Let's say that on the way to Mars, a few folks got very sick. If the illness spread to the Mars colony, there's a chance the losses could be catastrophic. Would Elon Musk, the Mars colony guy, deliberately kill everyone aboard, including the healthy passengers, to preserve the colony? Let's say that SpaceX wants to make babies on Mars, but that the birth rate was low. Would Elon Musk force people into arranged partnerships or coerce any gay or asexual people into heterosexual relationships, or lower the age of consent? And I'm about to hit you with one of the most buck wild statements of the entire video. According to the New York Times, Elon Musk wants to send his sperm to Mars to help get the colony going. What the fuck? Does Elon want to save humanity, or does he just want to make Mars babies with his Mars jizz. I just want to clarify, several SpaceX employees claim that last point was true, but Elon Musk has denied it. So it's up to you to decide whether Elon wants to turn Mars into his own personal cum zone. And imagine that SpaceX makes these ethically dubious decisions, and then the world doesn't end. That makes all this even worse somehow. It just means that all this dangerous stuff happened and it didn't even save humanity. It's like the fucking trolley problem, but SpaceX pushed everyone onto the tracks and now they're wondering who to save. And like, this wouldn't have been a problem if he didn't push all the people onto the fucking track. Fortunately, everything I mentioned is just a thought experiment. And it's probably nothing to worry about because it almost certainly won't happen. But here's something that's all too real. Elon Musk has a history of sexually assaulting women within SpaceX. As of this June, at least 10 former female SpaceX employees have come forward with claims that Elon Musk created and fostered a work environment that was highly uncomfortable and occasionally dangerous. One woman said that Elon Musk showed her his dick and offered her $250,000 in a pony for sexual favors. Other people have stated that SpaceX interns and employees committed multiple sexual assaults and faced zero consequences. When a group of women spoke up about their working conditions, they were fired. These problems are pervasive, and they've persisted for years. The women who work at SpaceX are smart, talented, and optimistic, and they are being hurt by a bunch of terrible men who view them as sex objects instead of human beings. I need to emphasize that although this problem is common within engineering professions, it is uniquely bad within SpaceX. And the demographics show it. According to Zippia, which to be clear isn't a great site for jobs, but they do have decent demographic data, around 86% of SpaceX employees were men. That's the single worst split I could find in the entire American aerospace industry, and it's certainly the worst among companies its size. It's worse than Boeing, Blue Origin, Lockheed Martin, ULA, NASA, and Northrop Grumman at least. While we're here, I'll also mention that SpaceX has a lower percentage of black employees than all of these companies except for Blue Origin. As of the making of this video essay, SpaceX hasn't been sued for being racist. At the very, very least, but Tesla has. To be perfectly clear, even white guys struggle while working at SpaceX. All employees are frequently exhausted due to unreachable quotas. They endure hazardous working conditions, including extreme heat, improper ventilation, inadequate safety protocols, and lack of accountability. This has led to over 600 injuries and at least one death, that of former United States Marine Corps member Lonnie LeBlanc. Tom Moline, a longtime SpaceX engineer, summarizes it best. Elon's concept that SpaceX is on a mission to go to Mars as fast as possible and save humanity permeates every part of the company. The company justifies casting aside anything that could stand in the way of accomplishing that goal, including worker safety. But employees who aren't straight white guys have to deal with all of those problems, plus an even more hostile workplace culture. At the very beginning of this video, I said that many rocket science educators have built a career on talking about spaceflight. What I didn't mention is that most of those people were straight white guys. And listen, I don't have a problem with white guys. I myself am half straight white guy on my father's side, but I do think it's telling that they're the only group of people who are so openly and vocally passionate about the future of spaceflight. And I also think it's telling that, as far as I know, none of them have even mentioned Elon's questionable choices around women, minorities, or LGBTQIA+ people. I hope that you, dear viewer, agree that no one should ever be abused or feel unsafe in their workplace. And I also hope you see the final problem with Starship. Almost every SpaceX fan is a white man, and no matter how many white men or alleged barrels of jizz Elon Musk sends to Mars, you just can't truly save humanity without a diverse and accepting colony, including one with a whole lot of women. Hi, this is Editing Bagel again. So there's a lot more to discuss about Starship. There are actually many more ways, some of which you might know about, in which Starship is bad, that I didn't cover in this video. But one, I feel like the vid's kind of long enough already. And two, and more importantly, I kind of wanted to get this off before the 5th flight test of Starship, and that is happening much sooner than planned. Like, the FAA denied SpaceX the right to launch their Starship because SpaceX is very bad at some paperwork and they needed to, like, get it all filed and squared away before they were able to launch. But, like, either that's somehow in the back channels been resolved, or SpaceX is just going to try to launch without FAA approval and see how much hot water they get themselves in. But regardless, that's happening very soon, so I kind of have to cut it off at some point. I want to make a part 2 though. Should I make a part 2? I really want to make a part 2. Anyway, here's the conclusion. I like the world. It's beautiful, and it's vibrant, and it's fragile, and it's my home. I think the world is worth living in, and I think it's worth loving, and I think it's worth saving, no matter how any rich guy feels. But even if I didn't love the world, even if I didn't want to feel the summer rain ever again, or see another wild animal, or swim in the ocean, or even just go outside for some fresh air, I would still be confounded by how poorly thought out Starship is. It is a vehicle born from the frantic lunges of a man poisoned by conspiracy theories. Someone who is smart, but deeply gullible. Starship cannot save humanity, and it will not save Elon Musk from himself. Starship bad. I said the thing. I want to thank everyone who made it this far. This was my first ever video essay, so it was a little rough around the edges, but I'm still proud of how it turned out. I made this video half to prove to myself that I could work on a big project for a while, because I want to go back to college now that I'm getting a little further along in my transition. And half because I feel like this message is super important and super under-discussed. So consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video with people who'd find it interesting. And if you really liked it, I have a Patreon link in the description. This video took like 2 full months for me to make, so I'm low-key hoping something comes out of it. I also stream pretty regularly on Twitch. It's mostly playing people's song requests on my violin, but I also talk about a bunch of other things. Feel free to drop by if you'd like. Be good to yourselves, and be good to each other, okay? I'm off to touch some grass.
Though below me I feel no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean, and still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now, and never harbor nor port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home.
That's a wrap, baby! I did it! Ah!